If you're joining us, you're actually joining us midstream. And the class that we've been going through is called A Biblical Theology of Politics. And a rough working subtitle is How Can Christians Live Faithfully in Relation to Earthly Governments? And so there's been sort of three parts to this class. So a rough outline is we began by looking at key Old Testament passages. We worked our way basically from Genesis all the way through the end of the Old Testament, looking at passages that have political coloring to them or political valence. And then we looked at key New Testament passages and themes, and we almost finished the New Testament when we broke for our summer break. So the one book we did not get to was Revelation, and that was not on purpose. I was not trying to duck Revelation, because that's what we're going to start out with, is the book of Revelation as we return. And then as we go on through the fall, we're going to look at 2,000 years of church history and 2,000 years of interaction between Christians trying to live faithfully and their interactions with earthly governments. So we are not without models when we want to look at all kinds of situations with Christians we're interacting with earthly governments. So again, we're asking, what does it look like for us in our time to live faithfully under the government which we have been given? I don't know if any of you are World War II buffs. Anybody heard of the Battle of the Bulge? It was near the end of World War II. It actually took place from December 1944 through January 1945. It was at the very end of World War II. And the Allied forces had landed on Normandy in June of 44, and almost all historians of the war agree that when the Allied forces established that beachhead in Normandy in northern France, that was the death blow for Hitler. But Hitler was not somebody who was going to surrender. He was never going to surrender. So even though the Allied forces were marching across France and Belgium toward Berlin, Hitler was sitting in his bunker fuming and raging and blaming everybody around him and blaming his people. And you would think maybe with his doom written out that he would just surrender. But what he did was launched one massive final counterattack against the Allied forces, and that was the Battle of the Bulge. And it was a surprise attack. He launched it in the middle of winter. He threw nearly 500,000 Nazi troops at the Allied lines. And the Allies were sort of, they were completely caught off guard. They weren't expecting this attack. They were kind of expecting him to do the rational thing and sort of give in. And so the Allied troops, they were exhausted. They were low on supplies. They were reinforced by green 18-year-old recruits. And so when Hitler launched this surprise counterattack, it initially punched a big hole in the Allied line, which was the name, the Bulge. It punched it nearly cut the Allied lines in half. They were able to rally and defeat the Nazis and then carry on their way to Germany, to Berlin. But this is sort of an example in my mind. The devil has been defeated. He's a defeated enemy. His doom is sealed. But he's not going to throw up a white flag, right? He's raging and fuming, and he's going to in his death throes, his death spasms, he's going to try to take out as many people as possible. And that's the age, we live in the age of the final spasms of the dragon, right? Christ has come, Christ has conquered sin and hell and death, and he has won our salvation. He has the game, the ending is already not in question, right? Christ has already won. And yet we live in this age between the first coming of Christ, where he accomplished all this, and the second coming of Christ, which has not happened yet. And there are still many rival powers to Christ's kingdom, and they're still thrashing around, doing real damage, and people are really dying. There were 180,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. Completely senseless, because it didn't have to happen. But it was the bloodiest battle of World War II. And so we live in this middle time between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, right? God's kingdom is already victorious. Jesus has already come. He's already won the victory through his life and death and resurrection. And yet, God's kingdom is not yet here in the sense of all rivals eliminated. We're not yet at a place where every knee has bowed and every tongue has confessed that Jesus Christ is Lord, where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. So that's sort of a big frame for this class, is if you can always keep this in mind, the already not yet nature of God's kingdom. Any thoughts on that? It's a big idea, but it's really important. And you might be saying, what does that have to do with politics? I thought we were going to be talking about government policy and the 2024 election. There's been a lot of water over the dam politically in the United States since the last time this class met. One thing that has not changed is Jesus is still king. He's still going to be victorious. He's still sovereign. He's still in charge. The devil is still thrashing around. Those things have not changed, even though a lot of other stuff has happened in the last 3 months. This is maybe the busiest political month or political 3 months I can remember in my lifetime, as far as crazy stuff that's happened. But God has not been taken by surprise by any of it. So I think the temptation that a lot of Christians face is one, treating government and politics as all important, all consuming, simple idolatry. And the other temptation is maybe to just put our heads in the sand and say, I'm checking out of all of this. I don't care, I don't know, I don't want to know. And I think those are both unfaithful positions. So I wanted to just do a quick review of the last 5 months of our class before we broke for the summer. So, and please feel free to slow me down, and because there's a lot of big ideas. There's also, I think, 16 weeks of these classes on the church website, if you want to go to that. Actually, it's on the church's YouTube page. So if you want more of this, check out Heartland's YouTube page. So a couple of working assumptions for this class is that God created us not as isolated individuals, but he created us as social beings, right? We need each other. And politics, in the best sense, is people in a shared community life trying to solve human problems. And so politics is actually, you could say it's native to us. We are political beings because we are social beings. Does that make sense? So sometimes we think of politics as strictly a bad thing, and I think that's not an honest assessment of what we are as human beings. Here's another assertion. This is kind of a radical claim, but I'm absolutely convinced of it. The gospel has to be public because all truth about reality is public. If we think something is important for human beings, that really matters, that's really real, then it's something that's public, right? And if the gospel is true, it has implications for our earthly societies, for our politics, for our life together. Jesus actually is king. We're not just talking about something in a remote spiritual realm, airy-fairy in the sky or in the sweet by and by. He actually reigns now. And the good news of his reign cannot be a private thing confined to Sunday mornings inside the walls of the church. It's actually the most important fact of the universe. Right? The world may not recognize that. The world may not recognize that Jesus reigns over this world. But as Christians, if we lose sight of that, it's at our peril. So any form of politics, any political structure that denies or disregards the most vital truth about reality, it's not gonna go well, right? And this will cause the natural separation of church and state instincts in us Westerners to bristle up. We'll look more at what this means, because it's not that we are seeking we're not seeking to usher in the kingdom of God by force over our neighbors, right? We're not requiring that our neighbors come with us to church this morning if they don't know God. So what does it look like to recognize the real reign of Christ and yet live in a world that does not yet fully recognize that, right? So we don't usher in the kingdom of God by force, but neither do we keep this truth neutered and silent and in the corner or safely inside the four walls of our church on Sunday mornings. Right? Thoughts about this? This is like 16 weeks worth of stuff. So this is another pretty radical claim, and we looked at this as we went through the Old Testament and the New Testament. God is doing something in human history to redeem all things, to redeem this world by establishing his reign. It's what history, it is the most fundamental meaning of history, is that God is establishing his reign. So we all know Genesis 1 and 2. God gave a mandate to Adam and Eve, to humanity. He said to fill the earth and subdue it and to reign and rule over it. And the fall screwed all that up, right? It really got jacked up. So humanity was built to reign and to rule with Christ. We try to reign and rule independently of Christ, and that messes a lot of things up. So God renewed his plan to establish his good rule over the world. He began that with a particular people in the Old Testament, with Israel. And Israel wasn't just a seed for what was coming. Israel was also on display in front of the surrounding nations who sometimes did honor God, sometimes did not. But Israel was meant to be a showcase, if you will, for God's reign. And eventually the reign of God, it's not confined to this little country in the Middle East, this little nation of Israel, one ethnic group. God's plan from the beginning was that his reign would go global, right? Because he is worthy of being worshiped by all peoples everywhere. And so eventually, this was not a diversion from the plan. This was part of the plan. The Gentiles would be, that's you and me. Most of us are not Jews in this room. Eventually, Gentiles would be grafted in. That was the plan from the beginning. So the church, as we move into the New Testament, the church is the New Testament people of God, still on display under God's reign. We are a miniature model of God's kingdom. And in a sense, we are sort of like people in a time machine from the future, from heaven, or God's perfect reign. We're dropped into an imperfect place, and we're meant to model the kingdom of God for a watching world. Either what they see either condemns them or welcomes them in to the kingdom themselves. In Matthew 28, he says, "Go into all the nations and disciple the nations," which in many ways is a restatement of the creation mandate in Genesis 2, right? To go into all the world. Thoughts about this? As we said, other kingdoms continue to resist God's reign now. That resistance is real, but it also has a expiration date on it, which we don't know yet what that date is. This is a lot. This is fire hose. This is 16 weeks of stuff. Any thoughts on this before we go on to Revelation? Is this too much? It's a lot. So,
Nathan?
Yeah.
I was just sitting here and looking at the clock, and it wasn't moving. I mean, it's just so slow.
Oh, you're right.
It's because it's not. I think where we look, where we put our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't know God, we have no idea that all this chaos is any plan from any person, from any God.
Right.
And but I thought, I don't think this class is ever going to get over. Not that this is great, but I'm thinking that is like what we put our eyes on, and people don't know unless we tell them, unless we show them by our love and mercy and kindness and sharing God's truth with them.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't know.
That's good. Thank you.
Give them mercy.
So we opened with talking about the Battle of the Bulge. You could say that Revelation and the politics of Revelation is sort of the Battle of the Bulge. It's the empire, the evil empire strikes back and ultimately gets crushed in its rebellion against God. And so I don't know what this is a difficult subject because Revelation is a complicated book. It's a challenging book. It's been challenging Bible scholars for 2,000 years. But there is a consensus among Bible scholars throughout 2,000 years of church history. And the consensus is not, and I realize this will come talk to me afterward if you're struggling with this. The consensus is not that Revelation is a sort of a secret decoder ring for the last 7 years of human history. It's actually, in my view, Revelation is the story of this entire church age between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, and the fact that the dragon, so to speak, there's lots of symbolism in Revelation, that Satan is still thrashing around doing enormous damage, but ultimately his days are numbered, and ultimately the people of God are kept by God. And so the book of Revelation, we'll get into it more as we go on, but it's meant for us. It's not meant for one slice of one generation at the end of human history. It's meant for the whole church. We'll try justify that scripturally as we go forward. So I read a deal recently about a international conference of pastors who are pastors in the persecuted church around the world. So places like Iran and China and North Africa. And someone took a little survey of these pastors and asked them, what is your favorite book in the Bible? And surprisingly, the book that popped up most often was the book of Revelation. And you would think, well, that's odd. Why would people in the persecuted church take Revelation as their favorite book? And it's because, I would argue, it's because they're living it out. So these are Christians dealing with great suffering and persecution from earthly powers. And we naturally want to question in times like this. We as an American church really don't know what that, it's kind of silly to say that we know what that feels like. We don't. We live in one of the most comfortable times in the history of the church for Christian people. Yes, there are bad things. Yes, the trajectory is discouraging. And yet, we're sitting here in a comfortable air-conditioned room, and no one is threatening, no one's knocking on our door, no one's threatening to drag our pastors off to jail. There are places in the world this morning where that's a real threat, right? And in places like that, the question is, that a person naturally asks is God still in charge? Does God still control history? So it's easy for us to forget Revelation is actually an epistle. We think of the Old Testament epistles as letters written from Paul or Peter or James to specific churches. Revelation is also an epistle, that is, it's a letter written from John to 7 specific churches that existed in a real time and a real place with real conditions. And it's easy for us to forget that. What were the circumstances of these 7 churches? We're going to look at that. So Revelation 1:4, it says it's addressed to the 7 churches that are in Asia. This is modern day Turkey. In fact, it would be Western Turkey, mostly Southwest Turkey. Places that you could, some of the names have changed, but some of them have not. You could go still visit these actual 7 cities today. At that point in time, they were under the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire had taken a very dark turn from being a pretty competent, pretty well-run. It was still brutal. It was still ruled by force, but it was ruled by a Senate, and it was ruled pretty competently under the Senate and under Caesar Augustus. And then it began to degenerate, and their system of changing leaders began to fall apart and become much more violent and much more unstable. And so Revelation was written probably in 95 AD under the Emperor Domitian. We'll talk about what that means. So here's a map of the Roman Empire. The darker red here is the Roman Empire. This most red section is the region of, it's called Asia, which is confusing because we think of Asia as all of this over here. But Asia was actually the name of a particular province of the Roman Empire. And so these 7 churches were in the Roman province of Asia. And you can see it's in the region of Ephesus down here. This is where Paul did a lot of his early missionary journeys. So what was the condition of these people? You remember Jesus lived the first 30 some years of, it's complicated, but basically 0 to 35 AD. And then Nero became emperor in 54 AD at the age of 16. Most of the New Testament epistles, that's most of Paul's letters, Peter's letters, James' letters, most of them were written under Nero's earlier reign. Nero started out okay, but as he got older, into his late teen years, fire that burned a third of Rome. A lot of historians think that Nero himself set that fire, or his lackeys set it, because after the fire cleared out, he built his palaces in that region of the city. But he was looking for a scapegoat, and his scapegoat was Christians. And so so just for a frame of reference, Paul, the later stages of Paul's ministry was the early 60s AD. So shortly after Paul's letters were finished, Rome really starts to take a much darker turn politically, and a really anti-Christian turn. So in the mid-60s AD, this is when Peter and Paul were both martyred, executed by Rome. Many other Christians were executed by Rome at this point. We have documentation from outside the New Testament that talks about Nero using Christians dipped in tar to be torches to light his garden parties. He was a bad dude, right? And he was increasingly crazy. And the Roman Empire became increasingly unstable as he personally became increasingly unstable. Thoughts or questions about this before we go on to the next? So, meanwhile, back in Israel, the Jews, who always hated Rome's occupation, they took advantage of this instability in Rome to stage a revolt against Rome. And they set off that revolt in 66 AD. So this is 2 years after the fire in Rome. And this is a fascinating story, but they initially were remarkably successful in seizing actual Roman garrisons, slaughtering a bunch of Roman soldiers. They kind of caught Rome off guard, and Rome was in an unstable time. And so for the first couple of years, what's called the Jewish-Roman War, from 66 AD to 70 AD, initially went in favor of the Jews. But it ended up being a 4-year war, unbelievably vicious and bloody, and a take no prisoners kind of war. As we said, initially the Jews won some major victories. Nero sent in one of his best generals, the general Vespasian, to put down the Jewish revolt. And Vespasian was eventually, well, we'll get to that. As we said, Nero became increasingly unstable, and his own court turned on him and was probably going to kill him. There were plots within his own court. And so he fled Rome in 68 AD, in the middle of the Jewish-Roman War. Of course, Rome was a long ways from Palestine, but he fled Rome in 68 AD and then eventually committed suicide at the age of 30. And so that set off what's called the Year of 4 Emperors in Rome. There was a big scramble in the power vacuum with Nero fleeing town. There was a big power scramble, and there was no good mechanism for succession from one ruler to the next. So in 1 year, Rome had 4 different emperors who rose, were murdered, rose, murdered, rose, murdered, rose up and murdered 4 times in 1 year. And then, you remember, Vespasian was the general who was executing the war against Israel. He left Israel to go back to Rome and eventually seized the throne in Rome. As we said, there was a civil war following Nero's death, 4 emperors in a single year. Vespasian left the Jewish war to go back to Rome, and he seized the throne, and he had enough power to make it stick. So he was now the emperor for the next number of years. And he appointed his son, Titus, to take over the war against the Jews that he was leaving, right? This war to put down the Jewish rebellion. Titus eventually prevailed over the Jews in 70 AD, and he absolutely wrecked Jerusalem and Israel, tore the city down brick by brick, enslaved, slaughtered everybody, the few survivors he enslaved, tore down the temple, this, one of the wonders of the ancient world, tore it down completely to the ground, dragged off all its stuff, slaughtered everybody, and then took the Jews and forcibly dispersed them throughout the empire, burned all their records, just left Israel in complete shambles. Desecrated the temple, destroyed the temple. Questions or thoughts about this? Vespasian had lots of sons, but he had another son, not Titus. When Vespasian died, the empire, the throne passed to Titus. Titus died unexpectedly, or expectedly. Hardly any emperors died in their beds of old age. He died probably murdered by his brother Domitian. So Domitian took the throne from his brother Titus. Does that make sense? So Domitian was the Roman emperor from 81 AD to 96 AD. So that brings us up to the writing of the book of Revelation, right? Which was written probably in 95 AD. So Domitian continued the persecution of Christians. He relaxed it a little bit. He wasn't as bad as Nero, but he was still persecuting Christians. Christians were still very much associated with the Jews, and you can imagine what the Romans thought of the Jews at this point, right? They were not it wasn't good. So 11 of the 12 apostles were martyred during this time period. John is the only one of the 12 left who hasn't been executed by Rome, right? And Domitian imprisons John on the island of Patmos in the Mediterranean Sea. And this is where John has his vision, which makes up most of the book of Revelation. So, John, after this vision, he writes it down in the book of Revelation and sends this letter to the 7 churches, 7 of the most persecuted churches in the empire, in this province called Asia. Do you think they had politics on their mind at all? Yes, they did. Politics were a pretty terrible reality in their day-to-day lives. Thoughts or questions or ideas?
So after the first 3 chapters of Revelation, that was sent before unto the end was also sent to the churches. It wasn't just the first 3 chapters.
No, the whole thing is a letter. It's a interesting book for lots of reasons, but we forget that it's first a letter, right? It's addressed to 7 specific churches living in actual conditions and actual time and place. And then he gives messages to each of those 7 churches, which are unique to each of their situations. But the one thing they all share in common is they're all facing pretty terrifying persecution from the government under which they live, or the empire under which they live, right? And then he tells them the contents of his vision, and the contents of the vision are not unrelated; they're not random to their circumstance, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So here's the question that Revelation is written to address. How can Jesus be King of Kings and Lord of Lords and ruler of all the earth, and yet Christians are experiencing unbelievable evil and resistance to God's kingdom all around them? Right? So if you're a Christian in 95 AD, Jesus completed his earthly ministry 60 years prior. He said he was going to come back. The vast majority of those people would have thought, he's coming back in my lifetime. He's coming back now. He's coming back soon. Or at least, if he won, if he was telling us the truth when he said he conquered sin and hell and death, why are we experiencing hell on earth and death of all of our leaders? We are experiencing an awful situation. I thought Jesus won. Like, what is going on, right? That's the question that any one of us dropped into that situation would be asking. Yeah.
We read a short devotion each morning written by Elizabeth Elliot. Susan was reading, and as she was reading, she came to the line, the mystery of, and I was already filling in the blank, the mystery of redemption or something. It's the mystery of evil.
The mystery of evil, yeah. Yeah, how is it that evil seems sometimes to be overwhelming, irresistible? It looks like the bad guys are going to win, and the good guys are going to lose, right? That's the primary question that Revelation is written to address. Or at least that's a significant part of what Revelation is written to address. So, backing up a little bit, in Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve to spread out throughout the whole earth, bring his good rain, bring his blessings throughout the earth, reflecting God's good reign, reflecting God's good design. And we know that goes off track. In Matthew 28, Jesus tells believers to spread out through the whole earth, discipling the nations, teaching the nations, right? Not just Israel, but all the nations, to do all that I have commanded you. This doesn't mean that we won't face fierce resistance. This doesn't mean that the principalities and powers, the Satan-inspired resistance, will surrender their strongholds without a fight, right? Nevertheless, Jesus reigns now. He's in control now, and his kingdom is expanding. I've already kind of used this example of France under Hitler. France was occupied by Hitler. It didn't rightfully belong to Hitler, but he was occupying it in a very real way with evil, right? And the Allied troops had to go back and take it, right? They had to go fight for it. It was rightfully theirs, but they still had to go take it. And I also thought of the Louisiana Purchase, like the U.S. government bought this massive territory, but they still had to go. Buying it was one thing, taking it was another thing altogether, right? I'm not speaking to the morality of these different things, but the fact is, the earth rightfully belongs to God, but in his sovereignty, in his design, he's chosen to work through human beings, through the church, to be the primary agent of taking back what's rightfully his, right? And again, that's not done with the sword. What is the primary way in which Christians conquer and take back what's rightfully God's for his kingdom. The gospel, and what's the primary way that the gospel has spread throughout the globe? Human beings, and largely suffering. Largely human beings, Christians, walking in the footsteps of Jesus and picking up a cross and suffering as we take the gospel into occupied territory. We conquer in the same way that our Master Jesus conquered, through self-sacrifice. That's a big part of the message of the book of Revelation. Christ has disarmed and he has humbled earthly governments. Earthly governments have always laid claims to deity. Rome claimed, the emperors after Augustus claimed to be gods on earth. Right? They claimed to bring salvation and peace to the earth. They did that by slaughtering millions of people. Christ said that all of their claims to deity were false claims. Their claims over the bodies and souls of the people who lived under their empires, Christ said he alone is worthy of their full allegiance and their worship, right? But the empire isn't going to go down without a fight, right? The evil empire strikes back. Thoughts on this? Is this too much fire hose? Is this too confusing?
I don't think we think about when we go to people to share the good news, we don't think about it as a sacrifice. To me, it's being what God wants you to be, and then in that doing, we often find that there, but we don't. Do we, Nathan, go out and say, I'm going to sacrifice my time for this? No, we in love, because Jesus is in us, we in love go out and show mercy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in the doing,
right.
Of course.
Yeah, his primary ministry was loving people, healing people, lifting up those who were ignored, rejected, and he got killed for it. Right? Yeah. Our posture is not our battle is not flesh and blood, right? People are not our enemies. They're people that are taken captive by the evil one to do his will, but our battle is not ultimately people, right? People are casualties. Our posture is love and mercy and forgiveness because we have been forgiven. Therefore, Jesus says from the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do, right? That is the basic game plan for God's claiming his reign and rule is in the footsteps of Jesus, right? So earthly governments, they have a choice in responding to Jesus' triumph, right? They can acknowledge his reign and remain humble in their exercise of justice and judgment, right? It would have been easy to think, okay, Jesus was the king, so there should be no more earthly governments, right? After Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. But in fact, the New Testament, we looked at this last spring, the New Testament authorizes human governments as a good thing, as Peter and Paul both write about the duty of Christians to try to honor the emperor, to try to honor the governor, to try to honor the civil magistrate, right? And that was Rome. That was, when they were writing that, it was under Nero. And so that's our job. Christ reigns, our allegiance is to him, but human governments are not abolished. They are reauthorized by the New Testament as a good thing, as part of common grace that is God's way of exercising his judgment. Or if human governments directly oppose Michaela, she was here.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sad baby.
that's all right. That's all right. What time is it? If human governments oppose Christ's reign, they've sealed their own doom. So Oliver O'Donovan, who's probably my favorite political theologian, he says that the book of Revelation shows us this moment of apocalyptic division. That is, in the book of Acts portrays the Roman Empire in ways that are pretty favorable. In other words, Paul, when he's running into trouble in his missionary journeys, most of the worst persecution he gets is from whom? It's from his fellow Jewish people, right? And quite often he's claiming protection as a Roman citizen. He's claiming his Roman rights he asks, when there's a plot against his life in Jerusalem, he asks to be sent to Rome for trial. He's seeking protection under the Roman system, protection from the Jews who want to kill him. And a lot of what you see in the book of Acts is a Roman Empire that's fairly sympathetic. In some ways sheltered the early church. In some of the ways that Cyrus of the Persians or Nebuchadnezzar, they were not good dudes, but at times they honored God and they protected God's people, and Cyrus helped them return and rebuild the temple and helped fund it and finance it. So at times when these empires are friendly towards God's people, good things happen for them. But when these empires turn bestial, which we'll see in Revelation, when they turn and try to slaughter the saints and drink the blood of the saints, then God is directly opposed to them in Revelation. So we'll see Revelation shows Rome turning from a sympathetic empire, or somewhat sympathetic, to fully bestial in its opposition to God. And Revelation, it draws on Old Testament models, primarily the books of Ezekiel and Daniel, and portrays the showdown between the kingdom of Christ and its opposition. John, who wrote the book of Revelation, he was facing a Roman Empire that was increasingly bold and bald-faced in its claims to deity. Like Nero claimed to be a god, Vespasian claimed to be a god, Titus and Domitian claimed to be God on earth. And they were increasingly persecuting the church. As we said, 11 of the apostles had been killed. Only John remains. The church has been scattered. Again, the Christians were thinking, I thought Jesus defeated the powers of sin and death and hell. What's with all of this defiance of God by the empire? And so John portrays this age between the first coming and the second coming of Christ as the last terrible spasms of a defeated dragon, the death throes of our great enemy. We'll get into the actual text next week. So if you want to read Revelation a couple of times this week, feel free. That's probably a good place to stop. Any thoughts on this?
the Bible into history is helpful.
And I think it's encouraging too, because we live in history, right? We live in a particular place, a particular moment. We don't know what everything means, the stuff that happens in Washington or the stuff that happens in the state. I mean, we know how we feel about a lot of it, but what is it? We don't know the outcomes. We don't know, is America going to survive this or not? Is it going to get better or not? We don't know. We live in an actual time and place, and so did they, right? They didn't know what was going to happen next either, except that they knew, and we know the end of the story. We don't know what it's going to look like to get from here to there. But it's easy to mystify them and to not think that they were real people with real lives and real problems, right? I think it's real people just like us, right?
And we were reminded that they were real people when Netanyahu came and gave his speech. When was
Yeah,
that?
this is back, probably in.
Yeah, a week or
15,
two ago.
No,
No.
probably in 14 or 15, spoke to the UN.
Okay.
And referred to the good relations that Israel had with Iran in all their history. He referred to Darius
Persia.
like,
Darius,
like he was a real person.
Yeah,
And
and he was. And the Iranians recognized Cyrus and Darius as real people too, right?
Yeah, but I said, great gummies.
Yeah,
I mean, it was
really
memorable
Right.
to me. In 36 minutes, he tied.
yeah,
He talked about history, but history that went back 20,
right. 2,500 years. Yeah. We look at our founding father as George Washington, which is legitimate. The modern day Iranians look at Cyrus as their George Washington, right? 2,500 years ago. They think about Cyrus the same way we think about George Washington. And Cyrus is in the Bible,
Yeah,
right?
right. And George Washington isn't.
No, he's not. Yeah, he missed the cutoff for the canon, right? By 2,000 years, yeah. Well, 1,700 years. So, other thoughts? There's a really interesting book written a few years back about looking at the relations between God's people and empires. And it's actually a mixed bag. Like sometimes empires like Cyrus are portrayed favorably. Sometimes Nebuchadnezzar is portrayed favorably. Other times, very much not, right? And the basic litmus test is, how are they treating the people of God, right? Cyrus is called God's anointed one at one point, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think we haven't lost any time, but I think we actually have gone about an hour, so. So feel free to check our work against the book of Revelation. Read it. It's not that long of a book, actually. You could pretty easily read it in a week. I'd encourage you to read it if you have time this week. It'd be basically 3 chapters a day to read it. And they're pretty short chapters, and they're interesting. It's kind of a page turner. Any final thoughts? All right, I'll close this in prayer. Thank you, God, for the fact that you are in charge and you're good and you know all things, and we are kept in your hands, and that no ultimate harm can befall the people of God that's not redeemable by you. And pray that you would help us as we look at this frankly difficult book. I pray that your Spirit Holy Spirit would guide us and give us an understanding of it. Not misuse it, but to actually use it in the way that it's intended. And I pray that you would be pleased by our study of it, and that we would be shaped to be more like you, and our church would be shaped to be more what you would have it to be, that we would be more loving and more faithful and more confident in you and your reign, your good reign and rule. And we ask these things in the name and in the power of Jesus. Amen.